Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're calling from in today. My name is Cesar Del Valle. Use he, him pronouns. I'm Director of Partnerships here at Candid. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, The Nonprofit Experience, Insights on Demographic Data Collection. Today, we'll be highlighting key insights and takeaways from a 6-month research project that was led by Kelly Brown at Viewpoint Consulting. We also have the pleasure of being joined by Nikki Chopra Richardson, Associate Director of TO Arts based out of California. Throughout today's conversation, please feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A, and our team will do their best to answer them live. We do also plan on allocating time at the end of this session for more live Q&A, and our team will also be dropping in a host of resources throughout the conversation and the discussion, ideally to complement that which is being discussed. We hope you all will find this useful and additive. Before diving into the research, however, we did want to focus on the evolution of the Demographics via Candid initiative and the road that led us to this research project. So nearly to the day 4 years ago, the country was gripped by the murder of George Floyd, the sad recurring reminder of the countless murders of far too many souls that were taken too soon and unjustly. It's nearly impossible to recount how much has transpired over these last 4 years, but back then it was a moment of awakening and reckoning for many of us. Within the social sector, the philanthropy sector particularly, funders really responded by desiring more visibility into the diversity makeup of their grantee community to inform racial equity pledges they were making at the time, or at minimum, to inform conversations around transparency and representation. As the data partner for many grant makers, Candid was approached and we were asked if we could provide demographic data on their grantees. At the same time, as a nonprofit ourselves, we experienced just how this desire manifested in what we saw as a survey burden. We received more than 100 unique demographic surveys in 2021 alone. Every survey with a small tweak to a question or an answer field meant that we needed to go back and resurvey our entire staff. So we thought to ourselves, of course, there must be a better way. As we were receiving these surveys, we also saw that funders that, frankly, we admire and we respect were asking us questions such as tallying our entire staff to 100% male-female binary, in essence, making any non-binary colleagues obsolete. So we saw that there was potentially a role for us to play in supporting the sector with standardized questions and answers, contributing towards best practices, and supporting the field with free and publicly available data that is centralized and standardized. In 2022, we began working with Viewpoint Consulting to revise our demographic taxonomy. Kelly and her team went through a thorough review of countless surveys, looking at census data and literature, and ultimately provided us with recommendations on how to best update our demographic questions and answer fields. To begin with, I want to be clear on what we mean when we say demographic data. For today, we're specifically speaking about the demographic makeup of an organization and not that of populations served. Currently, we are collecting race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability status, and we do so for the CEO, the board, the senior staff, and the entire staff. All of this data lives on the Candid GuideStar platform. This way, we began to leverage the already built infrastructure there. Continue along, and in 2023, we officially launched the Demographics via Candid initiative. As we like to say, we have so much love for demographic data, we officially launched on February 14th. We began making investments into field building and thought leadership while also recognizing an inherent challenge that this data represents. We released blogs speaking about why defining BIPOC-led is much harder than you actually think, and another on quantifying and measuring any set definition of BIPOC comes with its own unique challenges. As the demographics initiative evolved, we wanted to ensure we employed a user-centric approach, principally a nonprofit-centric approach. We sought to ensure we were responsive to feedback and building solutions informed by the field. We also wanted to ensure the demographic data we collected was seen as a public good. This data never lived behind a paywall. We never wanted to have it even live behind a sign-up wall. We made investments into public dashboards alongside the Tableau Foundation, and to this day, any actor, any social sector actor or beyond, can request free access to our entire demographic data set. In the summer of 2023, we heard from our grant-making partners that it was great we were making this data publicly available, but that it would be much better if it was flowing into their grants management system, as that's where they were already doing their due diligence. With this feedback, our team got to work, and a few months later, we launched a free demographics API. We now have that technically integrated with the bulk of grants management system providers. This is just one example of how this initiative aims to be user-informed. As the initiative continues to unfold, we have also made investments into ensuring those who access this data know how best to make meaning of the data. My colleagues will share in the chat, as they have been already with the resources, an excellent blog by our team that spotlights a research manual we released a few months back and the many ways to access this data for anyone interested. So we've covered a little bit with regards to the evolution of the demographics via Candid initiative, but what is this all meant in terms of outcomes? Arif, if you could please pull up our contributed data slide. What we're about to see here is the continued growth of contributed data. This is how the initiative has manifested and how it has now morphed into a movement. This continuous contribution of data of nearly 70,000 organizations now is due in large part to the efforts of our over 150 formal partners and our many allies that collectively support this work. As we continue to invest into the evolution of the initiative, a critical component will always be the need to understand the nonprofit experience and center your voice. With that, I would like to turn to Kelly Brown and discuss what this has looked like in practice. Kelly, if you'd please turn on your camera to join us. As you do so, I very briefly wanted to also mention how Candid has been leveraging this data. Most recently, we published the most comprehensive report on the state of diversity within the US nonprofit sector. We'll share a link in the report. We'll share a link in the chat of the report. Frankly, this report is incredible, and I would recommend anyone joining us today to read it. This data allows us to take a deep and objective look at how representative the nonprofit sector truly is and begin to understand where there may be some disparities in representation and potentially even some inequities. Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
I'd like to start speaking about you for a bit before we dive into the research. So perhaps you can just start by sharing a little bit more about yourself and your work, please.
Sure. Well, thanks, Cesar and Candid, my longtime friends. I often say I knew Candid before it was Candid, through many iterations and work in the field of philanthropy, which in my sense is over 30 years as a consultant, as program officer, as program director. So very much familiar with and wedded to and grounded and supported by the nonprofit, what I call the social sector field, and am committed to strengthening it through a lot of the work that I do. But much of the work that I've been engaged in, particularly in the past, I would say 10 to 15 years, has been focusing on strengthening the whole social sector, but philanthropy in particular, with better data and better data systems. I was the director of the D5 Coalition, which was a national effort to strengthen foundations, specifically through an engagement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in their policies, practices, funding, leadership, what have you. And in the context of that, we really began to realize that we couldn't answer a lot of the questions that the initiative was charged with without good data. And that was where we meaning Viewpoint and I personally sort of leaned into how can the sector strengthen its own awareness and knowledge and sense of its impact with better data across the board, but specifically demographic data, because if you don't know who you're serving or who you are along certain parameters, it's difficult to really understand your impact. So that's a bit about my background, and in my consulting role, I've worked with a number of partners, and most recently, as you mentioned, with Candid, to really ground what we're trying to do in the sector through this initiative with sound research and good direction, and most importantly, with clear input and guidance from nonprofits and social sector organizations themselves, because we know that foundations and funders and donors are important as consumers of data and supporters of the sector. But I think too often a rigorous analysis and a rigorous engagement of how nonprofits are experiencing practices across a range of things, in this case, particularly requesting demographic data to understand how nonprofits were experiencing it and in what ways could we strengthen their the experience for them. And so thus that was the rationale for the project that we're going to talk about today.
And I think we've all benefited from that rigor that we've seen. So thank you for that. And, before diving into the research that you just alluded to and the subsequent findings, I began by sharing a little bit about the origin and the evolution of the demographics via Candid initiative. And so I wanted to stay a bit zoomed out and begin by asking you, in your opinion, you know, you're beginning to touch on this, but like, why are we talking about demographic data today? And if you can just speak to its importance and its relevance, particularly within the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, please.
Sure. Yeah, well, it's interesting because I feel like through, again, a lot of my career sort of engaging demographic data in my spare time. I'm also a grad student and a sociologist where demographic data and these parameters are just de rigueur variables. They're aspects and data points and information that pretty much every sector really engages and understands because they know that it matters to how people experience the world and how people experience interventions. And so it's, I think, where I'm sort of committed and recognized as I moved through this sector was that this field, again, the philanthropy specifically and the social sector in general, really hadn't really engaged collecting and engaging sound demographic data in a way that could inform its work more substantively. That, how many languages do you need to translate your materials in? Do you have the human resources and the staffing capacity to engage changing demographics in your areas? Are the messages around climate change working on different populations? All of those things that relate to how good our work is relates to understanding who people are. And that's really what demographic data is. Demographic data is often framed, as I mentioned, as diversity data in it with a sense to define our workplaces and leadership reflecting the demographics. Are they inclusive? Are they equitable? And those are all extremely important things because, as you referred to earlier, sometimes that data can reveal inequities and disparities. But I guess it's important to understand why it's important to bring the social sector into alignment with the other sectors, just really about how understanding who you are and who you're serving really helps you just be better at what you're doing.
I love that. Thank you, Kelly. I know that you always bring both rigor as a researcher and the objectivity as a researcher, and it's all through the lens of trying to create, again, improvements for this sector, not necessarily it going in one direction or another. But again, we can't really track progress in any way unless we have some sound data to pull from.
Sure.
So with that, I appreciate it. I wanted to begin talking about the research project a little bit and just start from the beginning as far as in your words, we shared a little bit about the evolution of the initiative, but how would you describe the principal objectives of the project at the onset of it?
Right. Well, I think at the onset, again, because we had been working in partnership for, not only with Candid, but with also a number of foundations, really trying to, again, sort of build a foundation for strengthening what I call the data ecosystem or entity to address some of the technical issues and barriers with respect to collecting and sharing demographic data or data in general on the fragmentation, what have you. But what we really sort of realized was that essentially Candid is a vehicle for getting data from one place into others or a lot of other places. And I felt like we were getting good information from consumers of the data, but we were not getting real sound data from the people who are sharing the data, giving the data, collecting the data, and then putting it into the portal. What was that experience like? And so again, we had anecdotal things. We had, surveyed maybe a handful of one foundation's grantees or what have you. We've gotten kind of off the cuff feedback, but we really felt it was important to do a rigorous national study that really looked at a cross section of nonprofits across issue area, geography, revenue size, really trying to get a sample size from the whole Candid's whole database that we could query to understand how were nonprofits of all types or a range of types really experiencing engaging this portal. And we focus the inquiry, as you know, on on the Candid interface, specifically with their interface with demographic data, to understand what were the motivations for sharing or not, and the barriers to not sharing. What was the interface like? How easy? What sorts of supports were needed to make it easier? What motivations were underlying people or inhibiting people? And so that was the substance of kind of what we conducted the research on.
Thanks, Kelly. You started to speak a little bit about the breadth and the depth of the organizations that we were engaging, the manner in which you were thinking about a national representative sample. So there was a tremendous amount of intentionality that you and your team had from the outset. Could you just share a little bit more about the methodologies employed when you kicked off? Like, are we talking qualitative, quantitative? What did that look like, please?
Sure. Well, we sort of started with Candid Toll database, which is pretty much in many cases all 990 producing entities, and we sort of worked with you to sort of clean it, to focus in on active organizations above a certain sort of thresholds, organizations that had contact information, obviously, because we couldn't engage them if we couldn't contact them, and it left us with a sample of about 20,000 nonprofits, which is where we started, in a clean sense of like, these are the nonprofits that are sort of actively engaged in the field, and where we can reasonably expect to engage them and get some responses. So that's how we started the sample, and then we organized it so that we had good coverage, again, across the parameters I mentioned, across geography. So not just looking at the coast, not just looking at big cities, across issue areas, because again, we know a lot of not only organizational capacities fluctuate across different kinds of issues, from environment to arts to health to education, what have you. And then also revenue size, so that we were sure that we were getting not only larger organizations, or engaging not only larger organizations, but across that spectrum, and the small ones. So we organized the sample to be, and the survey process, to be sure that we had coverage, and the response process across all of those parameters, to be sure that we felt like the responses that we got from those parameters were suitable and high enough to make confident sort of extrapolations from what they wanted. And then, so we got I should also say that we ended up sort of testing the survey, refining it, making it comprehensible, making it manageable, making it just long enough and not too long, which forced us to really hone in the questions that we asked, and prioritize. But we also ended up refining the survey a bit, to focus for one survey going to those who had shared some demographic data through the portal, and those who had not shared any, so that the questions would make sense and there wouldn't be two non-applicables, but also so that we could refine a little bit around those two groups. And so we got response rates overall of about 9%, higher for those who had shared data, a little bit lower for those who have, but a response rate that we felt, given the general climate, was something that we could move forward on in terms of getting input. We supplemented the survey responses also with 16 one-on-one interviews, again, divided in half by individuals, organizations that had shared some data, and organizations that had not shared any, just to go a little bit deeper on what were the potential barriers, what supports people needed, and in particular, whether or not there were specific kinds of concerns, like concerns around privacy and what have you, that people had with respect to this data, so that we could get a better understanding of if that was real, because we knew that a lot of folks thought that was think that was an issue, and we really wanted to test that. So that was kind of the process. It was a mixed methods approach. And then we supplemented that with some conversations with a handful of foundation and philanthropy serving organizations, to get some input from folks who consume the data.
I think clearly we could have a longer session on just the efficacy behind surveys and all that goes into it. And even listening to you speak, I was seeing the weeks and the months go by as we landed on exactly how to execute upon that. As we begin now to discuss the findings themselves, I did want to highlight that you did recently write a blog on these findings. So Arif, if you could please share that blog, since I believe many of the attendees would appreciate reading in a little bit more detail about the findings and the methodology that you just described. So let's dive into some of those insights. Arif, if you could please pull up the first slide. So love to begin with some of the data that you shared here. which, what were the top reasons for nonprofits to share their demographic data from what you uncovered and from what this slide is sharing?
Right. Well, for those who were sharing data, the overwhelming motivation for folks to share that data was to meet the minimum requirements for securing a seal. That I think that sense of legitimacy and around transparency seemed to be very, 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 very important for a lot of the folks who were sharing data, and that is so. Again, our sense was that was an issue around transparency and visibility, but it's relating to their public image, and all of that is related to their ability to attract and secure donors. Interestingly, their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion was on the board, but not in the top one. And so I think it's important that it's sort of, in my mind, is indicating that, and what we heard from some of the conversations and the takeaways was that the nonprofits are seeing this as one aspect of transparency for which they should be rewarded and valued with a seal.
Thanks, Kelly. There's a lot there, and I'm excited to actually have Nikki speak a little bit about that as well in a few minutes. But Arif, if you can go to the next slide, please. There were a number of different factors that actually encouraged organizations to share their demographic data, again, for that subset that had already done so. I don't know if you could please speak to this slide.
Sure. And so we queried around folks, and this I think was a question that was particularly aimed at folks who were not sharing, which, by the way, it's important to note, again, I think we may mention in the blog, is that for those who were not sharing demographic data, the overwhelming reason that they weren't was because they didn't know they weren't. In other words, there wasn't awareness that aspect wasn't complete. And then we queried folks who were not sharing data and were aware that they were not sharing, and they had some concerns we'll get to on the next slide. But this slide sort of was trying to get at what would encourage people to start sharing, and clearly a better understanding of the visibility, which relates even to the data sharers, is if sharing this data will get me more face time or more visibility for funders, donors, and supporters. There was also this a sense from folks in this group around a better understanding of how generally someone would benefit or organization would benefit from sharing this information or these demographics or this piece of data, and installation of how the data would be used by consumers of it. And this is something that we really try and echo again with consumers of this data on the other end, is that really explaining why this data is important, what they're going to do with this information, similar to what they do with their budget information, their outcome information, their impact information. How is this this kind of data used in their process and decision making? I think
that's a key point that I definitely want to double click on in a second, but sorry, you're about to say.
No, please continue.
So, well, I know there was, I want to jump to the next slide in a second and speak a little bit about some of the barriers, but there was a component around the interaction and engagement that organizations had with the Candid GuideStar interface as well. Right. I don't know if you can share a little bit about what you uncovered there, please.
Right, actually, and we did learn overwhelmingly that the interface itself, the mechanics of putting the data in, generally was very easy and straightforward and clear. People, whatever barriers people had was more in the getting of the data rather than the inputting it and sharing it through Candid's portal, which I think was a really important takeaway, obviously, for Candid, but it was an important takeaway for really having a better understanding of investing in the mechanics of a field-wide system. So clearly that was not a barrier. Overwhelmingly, what the barrier was for both groups, for all groups, for everyone, was the staff capacity and resources to collect and engage the data in the way that people, appropriately, properly, importantly, and that included not only investing in the time and capacity, but also investing in some guidance and tools and standardization, basically things that would make it easy easier to collect and share this for organizations with limited capacity. And that's not only just small organizations, that's across the board. So so I think on the next slide there are
Right.
some issues around
Thank
the,
you.
what were the barriers, and this, this reinforces that the biggest barrier were time constraints.
Yeah, I mean, you can easily see here statistically how time constraints and, as you put it, the limited staff support as well was the top barrier. It's an insight that we really took to heart, and something that, of course, we had heard in the past. So I think about a year ago, our team started to really invest into more capacity building and resources. We actually produced a survey template and a user guide to support organizations in collecting demographic data, which our team will share in the chat. But there's a quarter of organizations here, a little bit over, that we're also talking about privacy and legal concerns. I don't know if you can speak about that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this reflects data from, as again, I mentioned, organizations that were not sharing and were aware that they were not sharing. This was their second most common concern. And I think that is an important concern to be aware of, but again, it's not the most important concern. And part of that larger, I think the larger concern around this is not only the sharing of the data, but it's also the collecting and engaging in general. And so I think it's an opportunity to better help organizations understand what are the parameters, the appropriate parameters around understanding aspects of people's identity. How do you invest in good practices like consensual self-reporting, meaning asking people to share their identity, and if they so choose, and asking for consent to share it through these vehicles is really the gold standard in terms of engaging this data. And it relates to some findings we also had around how folks were getting the data, which we can maybe talk about in the Q&A. But I
Sure.
think that the fact that was a concern means that there's an opportunity to build better understanding around what are the parameters there.
Yeah, it was helpful to hear that privacy perhaps wasn't the number one concern, but that doesn't necessarily make us complacent in it. I'm sure you and many of those on today's call aren't going to be shocked to hear that. Candid has been hearing the concern around privacy for some time. And so on our end, at least first and foremost, we want to ensure that demographic data that is contributed is being shared willingly, to your point on consent and best practices. But we are also looking into product modifications that will allow for greater agency for each individual nonprofit. And we're looking at product modifications that will allow organizations to actually control who sees their demographic data and who does not. And we'll be releasing new product features to begin to address some of these concerns in the coming quarters.
And one thing,
Of
can I just say one last thing before maybe
course.
you transition to Nikki, hopefully, is that I think overall what we took away, and from that first slide around the overwhelming rationale for sharing this information, is nonprofits sort of see Candid as a vehicle for transparency and visibility. And so people see it as a way to share information, not hide information. And so again, I think while demographics may have some certain elements around that people have to pay attention to, which happens at the front end on how you get the data and what you get consent to share. I think generally people felt like these are the things that are on my Candid profile are things that I want people to see, and that it's important to see. People want to be seen, and some people don't want to be seen, and individuals need to have the option to choose that. But I think that is one of the biggest takeaways that I think we got from this effort is how can we support nonprofit organizations and making it easy, feasible, non-burdensome to share who they are, what they do with as many people as possible.
So I have one last kind of quick question. You did mention that you looked into the methods employed by organizations that were collecting this information. I don't know if you wanted to share a little bit about what you uncovered as pertains to the processes that were employed as pertains to data collection itself.
Sure. Yeah, we did. And that is an arena, again, it sort of relates to the capacity issues, to the mechanisms and what have you. We asked how people were getting the information that they were then sharing via Candid, and about 27% said they were getting it informally through conversations, emails, things like that, but they were engaging in users. But about 37% were kind of guessing and assuming. And that, that it's interesting because it sort of speaks to the fact that regardless of whether we're collecting demographic data, we have demographic data. Now, or we're getting demographic data, whether we're getting it appropriately or not, or accurately is another thing. But it is an area where I think we really need to invest in supporting people to engage who people are, how they and how we engage them as respectively as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean hiding, and it doesn't necessarily mean ignoring who they are. And so building the capacities and the competencies to engage identity and be transparent about that more respectfully is what I think should really be a good purpose, because if the data isn't accurate, then why are you asking?
Yeah, and I know, in our many conversations, there is a quote that stuck with me as well that you said that informal data collection does not always mean low quality data, which I think is important to highlight. And I think that Nikki and I might be able to speak about that a little bit. You did mention again the importance of contextualization, the role that predominantly grant makers have, and I think some questions have come in the chat already in the Q&A about this. That it's important for those that are requesting this information to invest into explaining clearly why they're doing so, how it'll be utilized, et cetera. And so we did want to just share a couple of examples because we think that many foundations are doing this quite well. First example I'll ask Arif if you can please share in the chat is the Packard Foundation. They publish a blog every year. They have a page on their site that's public and freely available where they share more about the diversity makeup of their grantee community. And I love this as an example, not just because it's modeling transparency, but it really it is an invitation for accountability as well to their constituents. The second example we'll share, because I don't want it to seem like only large institutional private foundations have the means to be able to do this, is the Sewell Foundation, which is up in Maine, which is a big trust-based philanthropy funder. It's another one of Candid's demographics via Candid partners. The page that they've put together is really direct grantee communication, speaking to why they're collecting this. And what I love about this one is that they themselves are modeling, they're sharing, well, here's the demographic data of our team, of our board. And if we're going to be requesting this, we want to make sure that we're employing the same behavior. The last page that I'll just quickly have Arif shares from the Community Foundation of Kalamazoo. And in this page, it's just fantastic because Kalamazoo is not only sharing why they're collecting it, how they plan to use it, but they've laid out a host of different resources. I think you made it abundantly clear, Kelly, as to the importance to support organizations as they're collecting this information as they plan to contribute it. So I think this has been, I don't know, fascinating for myself at least. I did want to turn over to Nikki to hear a little bit more directly from an organization that actually took part in the research. So Nikki, I'd invite you to, thank you, turn on your camera. Welcome, pleasure to see you, to have you join us. Very similar to how we started the conversation with Kelly, Nikki. Well, first, I know you're traveling today. You're actually speaking at a conference later today. I think you're really embodying the nonprofit lifestyle of wearing a gazillion hats at a time. So thank you very much for joining us. So perhaps we could start again with yourself, and if you could share a little bit more about your work and TO Arts, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. TO Arts is a nonprofit partner of a regional venue of the Bank of America Performing Arts Center in Thousand Oaks, California. It's a public-private partnership with the city of Thousand Oaks, where we are the in-house presenter of a public venue, as well as the fundraising partner, and do a lot of work in the community for arts and arts exposure and arts education for the youth in particular.
Thank you. And, I know that I'd say I think if I recall correctly, you're about a $2 million budget organization.
Yeah.
I recall you mentioned that you have about a 10-person board by design.
Yeah.
And so, there's one thing that you mentioned in one of our conversations that I loved, and I'd appreciate if you can expand upon. And you said, well, one, that just DEI in general is deeply ingrained in the arts. And I believe you said something to the effect that the arts are a great equalizer. Could you share a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Sure. I mean, we're a performing arts venue, but it doesn't really matter if you're a performing arts presenter or you support visual arts, which we do as well. The person that you're standing next to or sitting next to, they may not look like you or not have the same socioeconomic background as you, but you're there consuming the same art and appreciating the same art. And at least in that moment, all differences could be set aside. And I feel like there's no other sector or industry that does that as well as we do.
I love that. Thank you. I appreciate that. You've also mentioned a little bit as to how you and in council and in dialogue with the board have taken very intentional measures to be purposeful of the types of performances that you actually put on and that you show, with one of the objectives being to actually diversify your audience.
Yeah.
Why has that been an intention, and what does that look like in practice?
So our venue is about 30 years old. Can you hear me clearly? I just want to make sure. So our venue is about 30 years old this year. And, our community started off as a bedroom community. People retired to our area. And so quite typically at the time, the audiences tended to be older Caucasian people, with means. And this discussion, I think, predates my time with this organization as well. But I think it is this particular board of directors in the last 7 years, and without going into too much history, our organization is the result of a merger of two large, long-standing arts organizations. So we are 7 years old in this version, but have a history of 20-year-old organizations with us. And but this particular board in this particular time made a very significant commitment to take that on, to take on that challenge. Okay, we've heard this, that we want to diversify our audiences. We've talked about it for years and years, but let's actually start to do something about it. And so to that effect, starting right around the time, I think in 2020, as you alluded to the murder of George Floyd, and then everybody was sort of awakening to this idea. Okay, we're thinking this way, but we don't have anything articulated or codified. And so, in fact, we're kind of proud about the fact that our organization led in this area, where we took on a statement of commitment, and then actually the city followed suit. So the city of Thousand Oaks took their lead from us in that, our board made this commitment and then followed it up with training, DEI training. We all went through about a year-long series of trainings where it was about learning a common language and kind of understanding unconscious bias and all of the different things that, you just don't think about. And it was fascinating work, and it is fascinating work, and it continues. We now have this work kind of codified in with the governance committee. It's something that continues, that we can, take a look at. But in terms of the audience's diversification, I'm really, really proud, because what the board made a commitment to was to take losses, to not just perform to present. We're not a producing entity; we're a presenting entity. So not just to present or shows that did well, that brought in the headline shows that will sell out, and in our demographic, in our area, it would be those sellout shows would be like REO Speedwagon and Chicago, the band, or even Frankie Valli. But to take losses on shows that celebrate the diversity of our community. We have brought different comedians and different artists across the board, and in fact started an outdoor concert series with the intention of introducing new genres of music to our audiences, just to expose them and to educate them.
Again, there's tremendous intentionality there, and again, I don't know if it's just my fortune, because I can hear you quite well, but I know a few members are asking if you can speak up a tiny bit, please. I wanted to turn kind of to your development hat. You've shared that you've been a fundraiser for the majority of your career, so I wanted to ask you around what actually led you to claim your Candid GuideStar profile, and then more specifically, what led you to seek out a seal of transparency?
Well, I think we talked about this a little bit. I'm not a hugely competitive person, but you put a form in front of me, and I can't help but fill it out, frankly. And I think that is a little bit human nature. I find that to be true even when we do certain fundraisers. If I put a pledge form in front of a group of people, they will fill that out. They may not put a dollar amount down, but they're going to give me their contact information. And we've actually used that quite successfully to grow our audience base and our donor base. But in terms of the Candid seal, honestly, it's been a best practice for me for my entire career. I sort of fell into this career, and I think the best sort of careers are the ones that you unintentionally fall into. I feel like I've asked this question of a lot of people, and that tends to be the case. It's not the one you strive for; it's the one you fall into. But anyway, so yes, it's been a best practice for me to do a Candid profile on every organization that I've ever worked for, and most times I'm the one who's starting the profile for the organization because no one else has thought to do this. And so now it's sort of like, okay, well, I got 21 and I got 22 and I got 23. Well, I better get 24. I can't have a gap in my profile. So it's sort of like, but in all honesty, I do appreciate, I appreciate the ability to take a moment, and it does take resource and it does take time. And for the last 6 years, I was the one person organization for TO Art. And what I find in filling out my Candid profile, it allows me to take a step back from my own organization and look at it a little bit more objectively and see if there's any gaps, and to answer those questions. And it also, frankly, helps me to create a narrative that I can then repurpose in so many different ways. We don't seek out a lot of grants necessarily, but I do speak to a lot of donors on a regular basis. And in writing it out for Candid, it gives me that content that I can then repurpose in so many different ways: marketing materials, e-newsletters, and all kinds of things.
Thank you. That's really helpful, just because I feel like that reiterates some of Kelly's findings, the appeal of the profile and the seal. But I think you've really kind of brought a little bit more granular detail as to why that may be the case for some. I think a similar question, on your profile, you have shared demographic data on the organization, on the board in particular. And kind of to one of the last questions I asked Kelly, for yourself, what was the process that you actually employed in collecting this data?
Yeah, we were one of those. Well, I can't say that, I think we sort of straddled between I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing, we don't have the gender identity question answered, but I'm seeing the demographic makeup, the racial and ethnic makeup of my board and of, the executive staff. And there's two of us, basically. So so it was not so much that I just did it by observation, as much as it also did come out of our DEI work a little bit. And I've been thinking about this since we last talked about it, because my last answer to you was, well, I looked around my 10-person board and I, wrote it down, which I do understand. It's not choice, and it takes away consent and takes away choice. And it's something that we are actually working to rectify. So we will be, initiating a small form that will just sort of become a part of the board onboarding process, where we give you your board covenant and we give you your board bylaws, or the organization's bylaws. And by the way, we need you to fill out this form if you wouldn't mind. So we're going to implement that. But in the short term, it came out of the DEI work, and where I heard people self-identify in some of those sessions. I think that's kind of where I took that answer from.
Yeah, I mean, back to kind of the last thing that Kelly and I were speaking about, how just, an informal process doesn't mean low quality data. And if I recall correctly from our conversation and speaking about the process you employed, one, it's fantastic to hear that you're looking to formalize the process moving forward, but it wasn't just the trainings and the work you were doing on identity. It's also because you deeply know your board. And if it weren't for those many years and those long relationships, perhaps a more formal process, if you were newly into this role, it would have been different. But I love to see how the wheels are turning in the direction in which you're going. And if I recall as well, you shared that it was an informal process that was applied at the time because of time constraints, which again is just reiterating some of the findings that we saw there. So it makes complete sense. And I think it's helpful to humanize this work. And we're not trying to, shame in any way. I think we're trying to all collectively move into a direction of best practices. But we recognize, as I mentioned, that you're wearing many hats and you're juggling a lot at the same time. And I think that's something that's going to reverberate with a lot of the folks on the call.
I think though, at least I'll speak to myself personally, I'm a huge systems person. Like I love having systems and processes in place. And as a predominantly one-person organization with support from city staff in certain areas, I have had to hit the ground running right out the gate. There was no time to codify and to put processes and systems in place. But it's something that we are now 7 years in looking into as an organization as a whole. And we've actually hired a consultant to help us with that exact thing. So the timing actually works out really nicely, for us to even look at this. Okay, well, how are we gathering this demographic information? That is also a system that needs to be in place.
Again, I think that just very human element would resonate with a lot of those that are joining us today. I'm looking at the clock, and so I would like to invite Kelly back so that we can begin to field some questions together that we've been receiving. As you're joining us back here, Kelly, are there any closing thoughts, Nikki, that you'd like to share just on how you engage with this data, tips or advice for others that are perhaps just, not even at the stage in their journey as far as where you are at?
Well, actually, I would say that, we are also a funder source. We fund arts organizations. We fund elementary schools for arts projects and arts education in the classroom. And I really do love the idea of saying, okay, we're collecting this data. At the moment, we actually don't collect any demographic data on any of our grantees. And we give grants both to nonprofit arts organizations as well as elementary schools. But I would love to. And so the question is, why do I need this data? And that sort of it has come out of this discussion, just hearing you and Kelly talk and seeing, some of the links that have been put into the chat. It's like, okay, this is, if I can't say that here's our demographic information, then what gives me the right to collect it from you? So I'm looking forward to this next stage of what we'll do with this.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks for coming back, Kelly. I did have a question that I wanted to start with you. And we've received this in a variety of formats from the registration page, which I think I've seen a couple of ancillary corollary questions come up in today's Q&A. But given your role and the way in which you're working with many grant makers throughout the country, in your opinion, what have you seen or what would you recommend? What support should a funder offer to their grantees if and when they make the Candid profile either a request or a requirement?
Right, that's a great question, because I think there, again, with the overwhelming response from folks was some level of support, and again, it's not just technical support. And many people said, I know how to do this, I just don't have the time. So I often say the support you can provide, though funders don't like for me to say this, is sort of add a zero to the check. But I think again, I think the resources, I do think, a lot of folks, you think about sort of mini grants and what have you, but I think that an important resource is just guidance on good best practice, like answering a lot of these frequently asked questions. Again, I can't stay out of the Q&A, so I've been looking at some of the questions around that keep coming up around, what kind of survey, how do we make the case, how do we, address sort of quote unquote privacy issues, what are standards, can we have a standard form? So pointing people to those kinds of guidance on those sorts of things, whether they're actual resources or frequently asked questions, is I think the biggest, can be the biggest support. Because even if you can add a staff person, if you can get some talking points for your board, or if you can get a sample survey that aligns with most of your funders, is important. I also think that the whole issue of what we're trying to do there, the whole rationale of trying to streamline the system and support building an ecosystem so that organizations can do it once and done, that a number of different folks can access, people can invest in getting the data up front, and there can be supports around that, but then once it's done, a lot of folks can access. I think we've heard from folks that would be a huge support.
Thanks, Kelly. Nikki, I recall you mentioning that from the outset, the entire time you've been there, you always felt pretty strongly and positively around the gender diversity that you had at the board. And we had a question come in that I wonder if you could just share your thoughts or your opinion, which was, what are your thoughts on how organizations can actually use this data to build the organization or to shape the future strategy of an organization, the demographic data in particular?
That's a hard question. I think for us, it's been sort of the cart before the horse, or sort of it's gone the other way around, right? We intentionally, actually, let me put it this way. When our board, we had a very core board of 6 people after the merger. And then there was the question of, well, we need to bring on a few more board members because that's a little too small. And it was, when the board looked around the room, they saw that, there was a certain average age. So there was an intentionality there that they made the decision that, okay, we need to make sure that the average age, is brought down a little bit. And they also looked at the gender diversity then to talk about, and sort of looked around the room and said, okay, well, we're pretty well, split. And that has always been something that's on the forefront of their mind that I can honestly say is not something that staff has had to drive. So I feel maybe lucky in that regard that this is a board that has, and these are members of the community who have been around a long time. So I don't think I'm doing a good job answering your question, honestly, except to say that I think this is becoming more and more important. And in some cases, it's not. I mean, it's important for funders and grantors, and it's important for us as a grant-making organization as well. And but with the donors, though, it's a mixed bag. Some people, it's not important.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I believe that the majority of your funding does not come from institutional foundations, and those are the ones that tend to be requesting a lot of this information. So it completely makes sense that, again, you're looking at representation of your community. You wanted to ensure that, and I think this is the type of data to have an objective conversation, so it doesn't feel like there's finger pointing or it's a subjective perspective that we're trying to take. There's a question that came in, Kelly, that I find would be applicable to many folks, and I think your perspective as a researcher would be really helpful, which is they wrote, how best can we report our data when a portion of our staff actually selects decline to state? So I feel like that's seen as a non-contributing data point, but I assume you feel quite differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important to bring out, is because a lot of people are asking about, keeping things private or we're too small to capture this data. And we have to remember is that when you're doing consensual reporting, when you're asking for this data, not choosing not to apply is a data point. That is a completely optional, valid data point to choose. And that's why we recommend that whenever people are asking them, however they ask it, whether they ask it over an email and say, I'm asking this question, and somebody says, I don't want to tell you that, that's a data point. And that's how you can still report your organizational demographics and still report how many people choose not to answer this question. That is completely valid. And it should be the norm. And I think sometimes people feel like, well, how can we get people to say this? And it's like, you don't get them. You ask them and they tell you, or they don't, and that's your data. And I think that because requesting this data from individuals is not a requirement. If people don't want to tell you for whatever reason, for whatever context, particularly when you're saying, I'm asking you for this reason, this is what I'm going to do with it, people have the right to not tell you. And it doesn't mean they're afraid or private, or it just means that they have the choice and they have the agency, and that's what you should allow. And that is a valid data point. And so even for the smallest organization, if there are 3 of you, you're all Black, and one person says, I don't want to tell you that, your data is 2 Black people and one chooses not to reply. So I think that's valid.
Yeah, I think we speak a lot about how the decline to state or choosing not to share is just as an important of a data point as any contributed data, because that's telling us about some of the potential limitations and where the staff is actually feeling. So
and it's much better to do that than to guess or to report on people anyway. So I think, yes, that's important.
So Kelly, we just had a minute to talk about this in our prior conversation, but a lot of what you shared both in the slides and in some of the major takeaways and insights was predominantly coming from the quantitative aspect of the research. but you did a number of different engagements, conversations with Nikki, many others. Can you just share a little bit about the qualitative feedback that you got?
Yeah, I think that, the qualitative research certainly, reinforced the quantitative work, but, we were able to get a little bit more nuanced. And it was in that space where people reinforced the idea of it would be good to know why people are asking these questions. It would be good to know what, how it's going to be used. There are absolutely some people who feel like this shouldn't be relevant. We shouldn't be asking these questions. We shouldn't be categorizing people. Completely and totally valid perspective. And a lot of more of wanting the ability to contextualize the data a little bit more. In other words, to not just check boxes or give numbers, but to have a space to kind of say, this is a larger, more nuanced sense of who we are, what this data means. And I really think that, Candid should consider how to capture that, because it's not only responding to a need, it's responding to a reality, because nobody is just a bunch of numbers across 4 parameters. Every setting is a complex setting. And so I think the degree to which people are, wanting to get a feel for that, or have an opportunity to give their data, their demographic data, some flavor, was really strengthened from some of the qualitative stuff.
So I'm mindful of time, and we have a few dozen questions in the Q&A. Based out of consent and privacy, we won't necessarily reach back out to you. But if anyone would like to reach out to us directly, please feel free to email us at partnerships@candid.org. We're happy to relay that either to Kelly or to Nikki, and they can respond. I know there's some questions for you, Nikki, on like what was the survey that you actually used or that you're thinking about using. Some interesting questions from a researcher perspective, Kelly, around your sociology background, the integration, utility, value, and leveraging of AI.
Yes.
The complexity of using the terms such as Caucasian, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
So if anyone would like to follow up, please reach out to us directly. But I am, again, mindful of time. And I just wanted to begin by thanking both Nikki and Kelly for joining us today. Nikki, especially considering that you're on the road. As we've shared, one of the key learnings coming out of your research, Kelly, was the desire from nonprofits to have additional support. So Arif, if you can please pull up the last slides, please. In this last slide here, you're going to see that we're looking forward to hosting our next webinar this coming Wednesday, June 5th, as we share practical tips on how you can actually add demographic data to your profiles. So there's a lot of questions that were in regards to that. We have some of our best trainers here, so please feel free to sign up for that session. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Arif. And for any grantmaker foundation that is joining us today, we definitely have a warm-hearted invitation for you to join the Demographics via Candid initiative. To sign on as a partner, you can go to candid.org/DDC to read a little bit more. Or similarly, again, you can see how you can contact us there at partnerships@candid.org. And again, lastly, as I've mentioned throughout today's conversation, we do want to ensure that we are centering the user voice in everything we do and everything we build. As such, your feedback is very important to us. So a survey will appear after the webinar closes. We would appreciate it if you would be able to take a couple of minutes and provide us with your thoughts on today's session. So with that, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure spending time with everyone today. Have a great rest of your day.